We can thank you, Aaron. So, welcome everyone. Good afternoon from LA, or actually good evening. Welcome to the fourth and last talk of the webinar series, which is part of the course Archaeology of Taiwan and Southeast Asia Maritime Worlds. This is being offered both at the National Chenchi University and at UCLA. I am Stephen Acabado, Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Before I introduce our talk today, I would like to acknowledge that as a land grant institution, the Asia Pacific Center and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. The webinar today is co-sponsored by the UCLA Asia Pacific Center, the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies through the PEMC, the Center for Taiwan Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies at the National Chenchi University, and the International Program for Austronesian Studies also at the National Chenchi University in Taipei. I would like to thank Aaron Miller, and Assistant Director of the Asia Pacific Center, and Nguyen Tong, Assistant Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, for arranging this webinar, the logistics of this series. I am grateful for our speaker today, who agreed to meet with my class, but I got surprised when I mentioned that it will be a public talk. He is an adjunct faculty in the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History at the University of San Carlos in Cebu City, Philippines. He serves as president of CAM, the International Committee for Archaeological Heritage Management, where he has contributed to review and the management of archaeological World Heritage sites. In his research, he has focused on historical ecology in archaeological landscapes in the Philippines and island Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, Hawaii, the US Southwest, and Texas, Northern New Spain, as well as Ecuador and Brazzaville, Congo. Please welcome Dr. Jan A. Peterson, who is giving a talk on Archaeological Inference and Alfred North Whitehead's Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness, the Austronesian migration as a case of reified realities. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Let me present a screen. I've got a lot of material because this is a very complex field, both historiographically and in actuality. So I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. Let's see how well I can get organized here. There we go. Okay. All right, you should see a title slide, correct?
There.
Okay. This title came to me because of a high school teacher that I had when I was about 14 years old, maybe 15 years old. He realized that I was very bored with his class, so he offered me the opportunity to do some independent research topics. He was a grad student at K-State in literature. And the first one was on Alfred North Whitehead's Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness and how the Romantic era in English poetry related to that. It was a fabulous turn on to me, to academics. What a brilliant high school teacher he was. He went on to give me two other topics that term. One of them was on the beat poets of the 1950s, and the other was on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which was his dissertation topic. Basically, this is not a difficult concept by Whitehead, who's such a brilliant historian and philosopher. Basically, what he's saying here is the map is not the territory. And that's one thing that strikes me about the Austronesian migration, or concepts or narratives about the Austronesian migration, is that in fact the map has become the territory, and we're going to examine some of the fallacies with it and some of the problems that have arisen from it over the last, 50 plus years. one way to look at archaeological knowledge and to interpret archaeological knowledge is through ways of thinking about or ways of reasoning about data, about empirical data. We have inference, deduction, induction, and this last is a contribution of a really brilliant article in a recent volume of the European Journal of Archaeology by Danilo Marco Campanaro on inference to the best explanation and archaeology, old tool, new model. The word abduction is strange to me. If you look it up, it means kidnapped, but I'm not sure that's what it means here. It means really more like what the best explanation is represented to be. And that means using basically multiple lines of evidence, but using them within the logic of their own disciplines, of the logic of their own field. With the Austronesian migration, I think one of the biggest complaints or criticisms has been that linguistics and archaeology and genetics have all been used as parallel lines of evidence that in fact have become circular because they basically use the archaeology for the dating, but actually the dating that was proposed is not correct. And the earlier dating within the linguistic model has been discarded as historical linguistics discarded glottochronology several decades ago. My first course in linguistic theory at the University of Texas at Austin in the 1980s, we still studied glottochronology as a real discipline in linguistics, but it's fallen out of favor. Some of the early dates for the expansion of what was considered the Austronesian language family were basically looking at its distribution throughout the Western Pacific, the Philippines, islands, Southeast Asia. And the one model posited that it came from within Taiwan. If we look at some tree models by Mark Donahue and Tim Denham, looking at representations by Pauli and Blust in the earlier statements about this, there was a Proto-Austronesian language that probably originated in the south coast of China, but at least 9 of the 10 branches went into Taiwan, into different Aboriginal valleys in Taiwan. One formed what's called Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, and Proto-Malayo-Polynesian is what then was dispersed from some sort of landhold in island Southeast Asia throughout the Western Pacific and the Philippines. This is the area of distribution of the Western Malayo-Polynesian. Okay, so a lot of people have complained, why do we call it the Austronesian migration then? Well, good question, and no one really has a good answer, because really what we're looking at is how Malayo-Polynesian spread from within a small area of the Pacific gradually to the south and out along north of New Guinea, out through the Bismarck Archipelago, and finally out to the far reaches of Polynesia, the Hawaiian Islands, and New Zealand. And in fact, one branch even went west to Madagascar. That's all been documented in current linguistic studies, global linguistic studies. So it was obviously a very profound and extensive migration, maybe one of the greatest and most far-flung in the history of the world. Why it happened and from where it happened and the mechanism for it happened, though, are really kind of the open questions that I think we need to consider here. When Richard Schutler and Jeffrey Mark got involved with archaeology and linguistics out in the Western Pacific, they published an article in '75, which was a pivotal year for this model because there was a meeting where Colin Renfrew's idea about Indo-European migration was being promoted as a global model. And this global model actually was proposed to probably have analogs throughout the world. So a group of people got together in that year and they proposed that, well, out of all the possible different models, at least Bantu migration and Austronesian migration sort of fit and were comparatively fit with the Indo-European model. A few years later, Renfrew was to publish a number of caveats about how to apply that model. And one was, of course, not mixing up the dating from one realm to another, and that actually could create circularities of argument. And I think ultimately, I think that's one of the biggest flaws of the Austronesian migration model as it's stated now. When it was first proposed by Bellwood, who took over the model, he proposed that it was actually a wave of, it was actually a replacement model, not a wave of advance like Renfrew had argued for Europe. And I should say that actually Renfrew's model has been discredited by historians and archaeologists in Europe. So a lot of recent data showing gene flow throughout Europe doesn't really coincide with Renfrew's model. And also the idea of a wave advance doesn't really fit with the realities of patchy and mosaic environments. I recall Carl Butzer criticizing the Renfrew model 40 years ago because it didn't recognize that people didn't settle in waves. They didn't move in waves. They moved like the Oklahoma land rush, where people would go in making opportunistic decisions about preferred niches in a mosaic, in what was called a mosaic environment. So there's a flaw perhaps with the express train from Taiwan model that eventually emerged from Bellwood's application. Bellwood claimed, and Bellwood and Jared Diamond actually promoted, that the simplest form of the basic hypothesis is that farmers and their culture replaced neighboring hunter-gatherers in the latter's culture. This hypothesis would be supported if all 5 independent types of evidence coincided in attesting the replacement of local hunter-gatherers by expanding farmers bearing their own archaeologically visible culture, domesticates, skeletal types, genes, and languages, and if all those indicators were traceable back to the farmer's homeland of origin. Our 2 clearest examples of such concordance of evidence are Neolithic populations speaking Austronesian languages and the expansion of farmers speaking Bantu languages. Well, there was quite a bit of early discussion about this. Stephen Oppenheimer wrote a brilliant article looking at the misapplication of the linguistic model. And he looked at the data and saw a center for focus, a center for activity actually in the area of the Sulu Sea and Sulawesi, with movements going out from a central area that probably were first informed from Sundaland. Those of you remembering your geography of Southeast Asia will know that Sundaland was the area that was above water during the last full glacial period. There was a lot of population movement and gene flow across this. And no doubt some of the earliest Philippine population movements came through this way and up even into northern Luzon, which we'll look at. Oppenheimer was prescient in showing the movement of peoples and possibly also the languages flowing from the center of this region and not from Taiwan, proposed by Bellwood, from the north to the south. And that's what we'll be looking at with some of the data that was then accrued to support the model. Okay, well, one of the big problems with the Austronesian migration is the fact that the language and the archaeology is in fact not congruent, but also the dates that are represented are not accurate in most cases. 4,000 years ago is pretty much widely used and was promoted by Bellwood as the period of time in which this happened. Earlier models by Bluth showed actually 5,500 years when this reached the other side of the Wallace line. Out in that area north of Sulawesi. And the reasons for this had to do with linguistic reconstructions, but Bellwood focused on 4,000 because he believed that the radiocarbon dates that were available at the time showed that would be the year in which these advances were taking place, because the whole package that was being exported or that was migrating included red slip pottery, included adzes, included sometimes nephrite or jade tools from Taiwan, and other things that made it appear that the movement was forming in southern Taiwan as horticultural villages, which then were transported, I guess, wholesale to northern Luzon and replanted there. Well, the next problem, though, with the dates, which I'll show you are problematic, is that they're scattered over that incredible wide region without much linearity, without much, there are no connecting dates. There are a few dated sites in northern Luzon. There's a very remote date in southern Mindanao in Zamboanga that Alexander Spohr reported in his work there from 4500 BP. And then there are some dates from about 3000 to 3400 years ago in the Marianas and Guam out in the Western Pacific, which look to be, by the pottery that's found there, connected with this same, at least pottery styles within the region. But there's no connection from those sites in northern Luzon to the south, and yet a line was drawn between them and then eastward into near Oceania and Oceania, as though the people moved in some linear, proscribed, and actually possibly sort of military convoy through the region, or let's say using that model of the express train as an express train through the region. The big problem is there are these huge gaps, but also we have no data at all to support most of that theory. And more work that's being done actually shows contradicting data that I'll show you as we go ahead. Okay, well, the other big problem, and maybe the biggest problem that I have with this Austronesian migration model, is there's no vehicle for migration. There's no theory of migration. Presumably people went in canoes. There are no known sailing vessels and no words in the Austronesian root language that have sailing vessels like the Paroa that eventually dominated the movement of peoples throughout island Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. There's no word for it, no indication there were any, and it appears that what boats were there were canoes that were paddled. Well, if you're in Taiwan and you go there today, you can see people taking boats out into the very rough seas on the east side of Taiwan or in the south. But if you try to paddle south from Taiwan, you run into something called the Kuroshio Current, which is going north, I think, about 7 knots, impossible to canoe against. Sailing against it is probably mostly impossible, although a good northeast trade wind might help you. I think it's widely acknowledged that the only way you could sail around to Luzon, though, would be at the very western side of the Kuroshio Current, and then probably you'd land up in Ilocos and not in the sites at the mouth of the Cagayan River. But as we look further toward the east, we can see that this canoe mode of settlement was more widespread, and also it represented the movement of peoples from along the coast of southern China and southeast, mainland Southeast Asia, who were probably coastal dwellers, littoral dwellers, mangrove swamp dwellers, living at that time along the shores, who were, as Robert Suggs argued in the early 60s, actually displaced by Chinese early state formation that probably put a lot of pressure on coastal peoples. And there was also climate change, extremely cold period in 4,200 years ago, up to 4,000 years ago, extreme drought. This would have probably been very problematic for mangrove swamps, would have caused people to uproot from settlements along the shore. Another actually prominent version of the Austronesian migration model was promoted by Bill Solheim about this time in the early 70s, because he viewed the Austronesians as, if it were to use that name, and he liked Maleo-Polynesian better anyway, but if you were to use the word Austronesian, he believed that they would have been maritime migrants who were living along the coast and living much like modern day Bajau, Moken, and other coastal dwellers. And the fabulous thing about those coastal dwellers is on those, especially with these little proas, they could travel a couple 100 miles in a few days by sea. And they didn't move in linear fashions. They moved more like in a swarm. They went to opportunities. They went to explore new areas of mangroves where maybe their prior homes were demolished by climate change. They maybe went to the lee side of islands to fish at certain times of the year, and the other side during other times, during the Habaga or southwest monsoon. And they also would go to visit kin groups and small villages of kin groups. And there's a really good literature for the Micronesia and the excuse me, Oceania of people, especially once atolls emerged about 2,000 years ago, people moving all over the region, visiting kin groups on villages, and widely spreading genes and language throughout the region. One of the things that made this possible is exemplified by something that the linguist F.K. Lehman pointed out, that in contrast to Western perception, space is a relation on points rather than an external and abstract grid. In Euclidean geometry, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, and this creates a view of space as a container. However, in a point field perception, space is defined as the topological neighborhood of a given point. Lehman and then David Herdrich, who was the HPO in Samoa, expand on this view with an analysis of field systems, field boundaries, and spatial perception represented in Samoan languages. It's very different from the way Magellan explored the Western Pacific, where he was clearly looking for a linear confirmation of movement by latitude around the world, but partly in an attempt to measure the distance to then be able to map longitudes and build a grid system or a container space in the region. Navigators in the Pacific travel instead by very, what would seem to us intuitive means, but much of it is actually also very phenomenological and very inductive. They look at various constellations in the sky. The boat itself is the center of the universe. And among the navigators, they feel, and they, Manny Sakau told me this, that when he gets in his boat, he isn't sailing toward Guam from Puluwat. Actually, Guam is coming toward him. He confirms his position with, of course, the sun and the moon, but also the constellations, and with the knowledge, the oral history of swells out on the ocean. And the swells can actually tell him where there are gaps between islands a couple of 100 miles away. It seems fantastic to us, but of course, the great work done by the navigators and then in collaboration with Ben Finney and others at University of Hawaii have documented this extraordinary knowledge. And one has to consider this knowledge as one of the fundamental drivers of the Austronesian migration. So in contrast to being about horticultural dwellers and villagers who presumably carried rice with them from the from an area in Taiwan where people weren't even yet growing rice, it looks more like they were probably more in concordance with Bill Solheim's Nusantau model, and more about that later. People living along the coast lived in thatch balai or stilt houses along the coast. And so, you know, we've been looking in the last few years all over the Philippines, as we did in Guam and Marianas when I was there. And Mike Carson found a number of sites along the coast with red slip pottery and indented designs going back to 3400 BP. They didn't necessarily live in stilt houses, but they lived near the shore, and they lived in sites that would have eroded out from the back of the high sea stand from 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. For those that aren't aware of this, the sea level rose steadily since the last glacial period from 100 meters below present up to about 2 meters above present by about 5,000 or 6,000 AD, and then has come back down. There was a very warm period around then in the middle Holocene, causing the sea level to be about 2 meters higher at that time, and then it fell back down. Well, so 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, if we're looking at settlement along shorelines, obviously, we have to look in an area above where the sea would have been at that time in the back beach area. And we find those sites in the Philippines, but the many that I have found so far don't appear to be from that early wave of quote unquote Austronesian dispersal. They look to me to be more of a generalized kind of Neolithic style, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But they are eroding out of this upper level, would have been a couple of meters higher, would have been near a shore, 2 to 3 to 4,000 years ago. You can see here how it erodes out. And here we see evidence of mangrove swamp use, the lagoon inside the coral reef, stone tools, expedient stone tools, use of tridacna. Maybe this was an adze, who knows? It's very worn by the sea, and some evidence of red slipping pottery. Also flaring, expanding rims. Sometimes we get carinated rims in this collection. The dates that we generally get for sites like this are not 4,000 years old, though they're generally in the range of even as late as 500 AD. but more like 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. We'll talk about that related to chronology building. We've been working, doing an extensive survey of northern Cebu in the last year, Jobers Versalis and I, and really originally 10 years ago, your host, Boboy Acabado, brought a University of Guam Field School over to San Remigio site and excavated. And we were looking at burials there and pottery, some jar burials from about 500 AD in that range. Not at all 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. And things we're finding in Bantayan today as part of our Northern Cebu survey with incised decorations, quite sophisticated decorations. We don't have dates on this yet, but so far the dates we do have look like we're more looking at Iron Age or 500 AD to maybe 2,500 years ago in what Bill Solheim called the Iron Age, which he extensively documented. Some of these are red slipped, as you can see. Some are not, or if they are, they're fugitive. It's a fugitive slip that's eroded away. Bill was most well known for his really brilliant and thorough, comprehensive survey of southern Philippines and Mindanao and the Sulu Sea, where he reported an Iron Age settlement from about 1,000 to 2,500 years ago, and called the Coloni. And he found a companion period in mainland Southeast Asia called the Sawin. He called it then finally regionally the Sawin Coloni. And it's Bill's belief that this was really the period of greatest dispersal of peoples that were speaking a Malayo-Polynesian language and living a coastal sea nomad lifestyle along the shores or near the shores, and possibly even burying in the interior. So very different models. Bill's based upon movement of people according to navigational skills and coastal lifeways. The Bellwood out of Taiwan model, mainly based upon spread of agriculture. One of the things that Robert Blust, the early linguist working on this problem, defined the Austronesian migration as having rice, because that was in the language, in the stock words in the language that were transported through the region. But the fact is, there hasn't really been much rice found from that early period, especially, and the rice that has been found arguably has been coming maybe more from Southeast Asia through Borneo and Sarawak. We'll look at that in a bit too. But again, we're looking at a lot of far-flung data, maybe not as much as we would like, but a lot of complex studies and analysis and theories and arguments that have taken place over the last 50 years. So it's hard to sort of unpack all that. And if I misspeak with a particular date or a particular age or something, forgive me, I can be taken to task for that. In preparing for this talk, I went through a lot of material that I haven't looked at for 10 years. Maybe John Terrell's on this panel. Maybe he can help us with some of that if we need to unpack it further. But the general trends in terms of the migration of animals, and there are some terms for domestic animals, tend to show people going through and northward through the Philippines, not north to south, but south to north. And then also, we tend to see that, well, there are words for some of those in the language, but following a model that Roger Blench has proposed in the last few years, there may have been a big boiling pot up in this part of, from the southern Chinese coast over into the southern tip of Taiwan and toward northern part of Philippines, where there was a lot of movement. This would really fit the movement of peoples as maritime migrants who could have freely and easily sailed through this whole region. In fact, almost certainly did all the way down to here and around. And they could have easily brought that, and later we'll see that Ethel Anderson, who critiques Bellwood's dates, really suggests that possibly a movement of people into northern Luzon through Ilocos might even be more reasonable given the Curaçao current here. Again, a lot of complex information, but there have been some things clearly misstated, but many things are still quite controversial. Now, a recent genetic study suggests that there were actually not just one single movement of peoples into the Philippines, and certainly not during the purported Austronesian migration period of 4,000 years ago, But Max Lorena and others have documented widespread movements through the region, first with Negrito peoples in the north, maybe as early as 46,000 years ago. It split into a southern Aita movement of Negritos in the Philippines. This concords nicely with the dates of 67,000 years ago for human remains in Callao Cave. Of course, no linguistic model would turn up Homo erectus discoveries from 700,000 years ago, but those also may have moved up during a period of land bridges up into the north, as documented in the Kalinga site in northern Luzon and the Cagayan Valley by others recently also. But there were, in Lorena's model, the next period of people was by Sama related peoples through the south, Manobo peoples that show up then in Mindanao. And then lastly, about 8 to 10,000 years ago, a group of ancestral Cordilleran people who moved into the region, also probably moving into Taiwan at the same time. There are a little bit of markers from Taiwan, from Austronesian Taiwan genes, but showing that this was actually the ancestral homeland of most of the, what we would think of as the Maleo-Polynesian Filipinos. And 8 to 10,000 years ago is an interesting time period. We don't really have very many sites at all in the Philippines from that period. And we'll have to do a lot of searching to try to see if we can actually find archaeology that would conform with that genetic model. But that was just published, and it'll be an intriguing task to move forward with. This shows some of Lorena's text. I included here. If you can screen save this, you can read it at your leisure. And I have the DOI information. You can go directly to the article. Fabulous article. A lot of new perspectives on settlement in the Philippines. Has really very little to do with the Austronesian model. We'll have to see how that concords. Now back to some of the data. So one of the dates that Peter Bellwood argues strenuously for is from a few sites in northern Luzon, including the Nagsabaran site in the lower reaches of the Cagayan River Valley, which is here, and also sites of Magapid, others we'll look at in a minute. In 2010, Mark Donahue and Tim Denham published a really fine article on using language and developing a sort of a mosaic model of settlement, saying that the genetic and the linguistic and the archaeological data all suggested more of what they called a mosaic pattern. John Terrell took them to task on that, saying that a mosaic to him is a tessellated floor. He might want to comment on that later. And I think, in fact, it brings up the idea that we need to be looking for a way to describe this more networking style of migration that we see with the navigators. And I like the term reticulate migration. I find that a couple of other people used it. I got it from a book called The Tangled Tree about horizontal gene transfer, describing the mode of chromosomal exchange between DNA within different species. An incredible concept. But Athol Anderson used the word reticularity of migration. And I noticed recently that Christoph Sands and Scarlett Chu used the term reticulate migration in an article some 10 years ago. So it's already partly in the literature. It seems to describe very well this mode of migration. But in any case, Bellwood, intent upon proving that this Austronesian migration happened 4,000 years ago, in his response to Donahue and Denham's article, points out that, well, that's ridiculous because Xiao Chun Hung proved in 2008 that the sites were dead on 4,000 years ago, and this narrowed it down to northern Luzon with a direct connection to Taiwan across the straits. Well, if we look at the actual site and where the pottery was found, the red slip pottery, which was the key to calling this a site of Austronesian migration, these are the red slip potteries. The dates actually came from this lower silts. Now, she noticed an unconformity in the deposition of the two silts. I can't recall now, it may have been color or lithology, I can't recall. But in any case, if you look at the map of the, if you look at the map of the site itself, down in the very lower corner, and my gallery is obscuring it at the minute. Let's see. P9 is the unit that this column was recorded in. And P9 is in the middle of what, if you look at a stream flowing here, and then you look at the contours of what's an elevated highland here, you see that there was actually a channel here at some point in time, a chute channel that may have been this earlier relic channel for that stream. I would submit that actually this lower sediment was deposited during some earlier chute channel flow, and that what's in this layer here may have even been transported onto the top of that other during another later deposition from stream flow, channel flow, and that may have in fact been eroded down from higher settlements. Now, I'm not sure about that, but I will say that there's an unconformity which shows that the radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal don't conform with the pottery that's in this upper level. Now the dates I have here reported, the lowest unit was considered to be 3,300 years BC, quite early. And she uses that sort of using linear interpolation to argue that there was actually therefore the zone that the red slip pottery was in was 4,000 or 3,000, excuse me, 2000 BCE, because it was younger than this older deposition. There was also a pig tooth found. Again, it was sort of in the wash, though, of those depositional units. So it's difficult for anyone to say that it was that the date was in primary context. And the stratigraphy was kind of confused, I have to say. Noel Amano and Phil Piper looked at the upper levels. This area here was a shell midden, and they went through and cleaned up some of the dating and stratigraphy here. But that's all post 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. And this level here that is being argued is 4,000 years ago actually didn't have a radiocarbon date directly associated with it from that period. From her dissertation, you can see P9, one of the oldest, is the 150 centimeter deep date, which had a conventional age of 4450, right in the 4,000 zone. But when calibrated, it's actually 3,000 to 3,300 BC, older, more like that other earlier date, but it's not in the same zone as the pottery. But then if you look at some of the other dates from like this one here, from 180 centimeters deep in P9 instead of 30 centimeters deeper than this, it's actually dating to 800 BC. And what this shows is probably a lot of mixing of deposits. It could have been during deposition, redeposition, or it could have been from bioturbation, from critters crawling around in those nice, lovely, loose alluvial soils. One really has to use solid features to date, especially in alluvial settings. When we look at the Andorian site in a minute, I'll show you that their dating of a hearth and pottery in a hearth, a rather solid feature, is pretty reliable dating. But this is very interpretable, and it was interpreted by Bellwood as a definitive confirmation of the Austronesian migration and the red slip pottery appearing 4,000 years ago in northern Luzon. Another phase to this argument, linking Taiwan and Cagayan, showed up in a current anthropology article a few years ago, where it was proposed, this is Carson and Xiao Chun Hung, where it was proposed that there was a marine intrusion in the Cagayan River Valley, 2200 to 1500 BC, well, around the time of the Austronesian migration. And the argument was that these wetlands were actually associated with the favored locale of Austronesian sailors and settlers. Even though they were considered horticulturists, they did seem to favor this model of settling in the wetlands and the marshes and so forth. And you see it links up to this Andorian site a few hundred kilometers to the south, showing it right on the shoreline of this marine intrusion. Well, there are some problems with factuality here. Again, the map is not the territory. Recent studies by Elizabeth Dingle and her colleagues actually show that the Cagayan River, and I think they have that here, let's see. The Cagayan River actually is a very dynamic environment, but that there hasn't been a subsidence basin in the region for at least the last 10 to 12 million years. Carson and Hung argued that this was due to a subsidence in the region, but that subsidence last occurred 10 to 12 million years ago and not since. And the model that Dingle develops for flow through the Cagayan Valley is that there's an enormous volume of flow toward the sea, dropping pretty steadily from the highlands. And in Magapit, which is, let's see, I'll show you Magapit here compared to Andarayan down here. The sea is actually higher there. The sea, the land and the river is actually 5 to 10 meters above modern average mean sea level. And Tuguegarao, where the Andarayan site is located, is 10 to 15 meters above AMSL. A high sea still stand of 1.8 to 2 meters above modern levels is hardly possible to have flooded the interior as proposed. It wasn't a subsidence basin. So this model was proposed in current anthropology. No one took it on. I was kind of surprised because the data is very easily available to look at the river channel history. But the interesting thing about that river channel history is that Dingle and et al. Argued that the Cagayan River is of course moving an enormous amount of sediments out to the sea every year. And in the course of doing that, moves 300 meters across the channel every 10 years. Incredibly dynamic environment. It's just good luck for us that Andarayan site was exposed on a higher terrace, because every year that river chews up old terraces and lays down new ones. And if you go there during spring or during the flood in the early summer, you'll see that it's an incredibly dynamic environment, brim to brim flooding down the river. Now, part of this is to show, to demonstrate that in an article about paleo landscapes of Taiwan and Cagayan, that Taiwan and the Cagayan Valley were actually very similar environments and would have been very appealing for settlement from Taiwan. But this, to me, is really an odd argument to make. If you've been to Eastern Taiwan, you know it's an incredibly subtropical to tropical, or to temperate environment with steep drainages in primary to secondary streams from the mountains, a lot of fresh water coming out along the shore. You can see a very rocky, gravelly beach, very, very high seas coming in constantly. And also it's in an area of enormous uplift, probably the fastest rate of uplift in the world. Sites that were laid down 4,000 years ago are actually 40 meters above sea level now. That's incredible. Carson noted that, and I think that's absolutely right. Sites that he's been looking for there with Xiaochun are actually in that 40 meters above sea level range. But if you look at these areas and you see the opportunities from the sea and the opportunities along all these fresh, cool river valleys with farming up and down in alluvial terraces along the rivers, it's quite different from the Cagayan, which is an incredibly hot, arid, blasted environment. If you're there in the summer, the winds are shockingly hot and dehydrating, and the temperatures go up into the 40s centigrade. I think 47 degrees centigrade at one point. There was a record temperature recorded in that area. And it's a coastline that has mangroves, but there are no mangroves on the eastern Taiwan coast. And there are some, but very few. It's at the very northern range of mangroves in the Western Pacific. But they're on the southwest side of Taiwan. They could have been part of that movement within Blench's boiling pot or in the northern part of the South China Sea. But this is a very alien environment to compare to Taiwan. I fail to see how people would be attracted to it. Having been in Taiwan, I'd turn around and go back, I'm sorry to say. Anyway, again, you can do screenshots of these if you care to read them in any more detail. But I want to look at another site. This is Callao Cave in the Peña Blanca Plateau. And this is just to show again how people are sort of loose and fast with the dates. This describes a stratum with clay Linglingo earrings. Linglingo earrings has an indentation in the bottom and it can be fastened into the ear. Red slipped and black pottery and so forth. Tubular beads, all of these said to be part of the Austronesian complex. No dates there, but in another level, level 4, there are dates and they're comparing it to the 3,500 to 3,000 BP Magapit Hill site. This date is actually very problematic. I'll go into that in a minute, I think, because there are a series of dates that were done in the northern Philippines in the early 70s, attributed to a lab in Japan called the Gakushuan lab. And almost all scholars have thrown those out as unreliable dates. Matthew Spriggs wrote 2 really great articles on radiocarbon hygiene in the Philippines, and he cites like the Dimalit site over in the east, back to in the 5000s BP, he cites as problematic. Magapit, the earlier Magapit dates were problematic. Carson and Hung worked there later, 10 years ago or so. Those dates, I believe, were all post 2000 or 2500, although they weren't able to work lower in the site because the adjoining landowners got in a feud over the site, and it's very unfortunate. They had to leave the site after they were only down through the shell midden. But anyway, an AMS date uncalibrated and then calibrated to 3600 is used, but the radiocarbon date was from level 4, and it's not in the same zone as all those red slip pots. It's below it, and once again, in units that are shown as unconformably unconformably related, or let's say unrelated, in the stratigraphic profiles. So the dates actually underlie the period, the area where the sherds were found. This is another showing all the units within the cave. Of course, the cave is very well known now because of the discovery of hominid remains there dating back to 67,000 years ago, possibly a different species. But the stratigraphy is very complicated because there's water flow from within the cave out toward this mouth. And there appears to have been a lot of redeposition of materials from farther up in the cave, even in that lowest level with the 67,000-year-old human remains. And those upper remains have been flooded and redeposited. So again, very problematic. And yet these things are used routinely in discussions as evidence or proof of red slip pottery from 4,000 years ago. Okay, well, going again to dates, there's a recent article. Let's see, I thought I had the citation. Here's the citation. Take a quick screenshot. I thought I had it on the slide already. By Ethan Cochran and Tim Reith, where they went through all the radiocarbon dates associated with red slip pottery in the region, and then did Bayesian analysis, which is a kind of statistical inference where you look at new cases compared to old cases to look at the, well, you can rank them within the sites and you can rank them between the sites or among the sites. And in doing so, what they found was that actually the earliest dates for their analysis were, were from a site in Borneo, the MDO site, MAD site, and about equal with the sites, the dates reported for Nagsabaran, Luzon. But as I showed you, those dates from Nagsabaran aren't really the dates of that pottery. It's not the dates of the red slip pottery. It could be later. The fact is, it could be anywhere from later up to about 2,500 years ago, but probably it's in the range of 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. I'm just guessing. Using linear interpolation, they assume that it would be 4,000 years ago. Even in that analysis, the Borneo dates are older than the northern Philippines dates and the Nagsabaran dates. And if you look throughout the region, you see a real pattern emerging of dates around in the 3,000s of years ago, but up to 2,000 and 2,500, 2,000 BP and 3,000 years ago. There's a real congruence of dates, and these were the dates found with red slip pottery. Now, if we look at all the different dates throughout the region, some not considered to be with the red slip pottery, there's really an explosion of dates from somewhere around even the early Common Era, but earlier, back between 500 to 2,500 BC. Anyway, Cochrane and Reith document that the earliest stream of movement was more than likely from the southwest, going northward, and again, pointing to problems with that north to south model in the region. And here's some of the narrative from their article. Basically, what they consider is that there was evidence for multi-directional movement of Neolithic populations and ideas across island Southeast Asia after the first Neolithic deposits. And here they say in the northern Philippines and Borneo, but I think we'd have to really critique whether the northern Philippines is even coeval with those sites from Borneo based upon what we know about the stratigraphy there. Considering the out of Taiwan and the Western Malayo-Polynesian hypotheses for Neolithic dispersal, their calibration actually supports contemporaneous pottery, again, not critiquing the stratigraphy, but even so do not reveal singular or primary rates of dispersal in the region. Now, this is interesting because several years ago, at the 2006 Indo-Pacific Prehistory Association in Manila, Peter Bellwood was the chair. He was the head of the president of the organization, and he was giving an introduction, rather elaborate introduction about the conference and the state of knowledge in the region. And he got to Austronesian migration. And around that time, there were beginning to appear some criticisms in the literature, and he was emphatic. He was quite irritated, in fact, and he said, Austronesian migration is a fact. I wish you all would get over that. It's a fact. Well, sitting at the base of the stage was Bill Solheim, elderly gentleman who had begun working in the 50s in the region, who was sitting, chuckling, rocking back and forth. And later he said, well, of course those things appear. Of course you have nephrite all through the region. Of course you have red slip pottery. Of course you have all these settlements. That's actually evidence of the movement as sort of multicultural, multi-directional through the region instead of in single or primary routes of dispersal. Of course you'll find it. It's everywhere, he said. Anyway, that was a revealing moment in the history of personalities in the region, and certainly at the IPPA in 2006. The Nusantau versus the Austronesian migration model in direct confrontation. Well, quickly I'll move on and finish this, but there's another little case critiquing dates. Athol Anderson actually worked on a same project as Peter Bellwood and the Batanes. And he actually came away with different conclusions, but also some different modeling of the data. And here we go to radiocarbon dates. Peter Bellwood was very happy with these dates from the Tauranga cave, very early, showing probably a 4,000 to 4,500 year old settlement. He associated it with red slip pottery. Athol threw them out because the Tauranga deposits, he said, were incredibly confused and disturbed and didn't really fit. And his model of the Batanes dates shows them at less than 3,000 years old, more in line with the rush of dates we're getting through the region. Also, we'll see even in Athol's table, though, he showed Pamitan and Magapit as viable dates in the region, but these were Gakashuan dates, not considered particularly reliable. So they really, unfortunately, need to be thrown out. And the Nagsabaran dates actually turn out to be problematic for other reasons. We'll look at the Andarayan dates here in a second. But Athol concludes that the migration, he talks about the Kurashino current, but he talks about migration in the region and argues that there was no linear dispersal from east to west. And he thinks, in fact, that the Batanes might have been settled from south to north rather than from north to south. So a contradiction even within the same, among colleagues within the same project. Mark Horrocks and I worked on materials from the Andarayan site about 10 years ago. We collected materials from 3 different paleosols that were exposed in a road cut. I'll show you in a second. But I want to show you the dates first. They were in BT horizons. The highest dates were in the range of, the youngest dates were in the range of 1421 to 1447 AD CE. The next were about 1,000 years older, and the next were a few hundred years older than that. In those, we got, what was really interesting about this was that in the stratigraphy for that, we found a lot of red slip pottery. It was very similar in any one of the 3 levels of the paleosols that were exposed. And in the microfossil records, what we found was remarkable congruity among the sites. Mark has discovered a way to search for rice starch in remains. Some of this was reported from the Ifugao Kiangan site. He found it in all three of the different paleosols there in Andarayan, as well as taro and cassava. And among the pollen, the phytoliths and so forth. Oh, I had another picture there and it's gone away. Damn. I had a slide that showed the Andarayan site in relationship to the road cut that we excavated. The road cut was about one terrace level higher than the original site. And I have to give great thanks and credit to Adam Soriano, recently deceased, a great archaeologist. As a young boy, he worked on the site with his dad, who was a National Museum staffer at the time, worked with Dick Schutler and Brian Snow. The site was never properly located on maps, even in the reports, in the literature. And Adam took us directly to the spot. We didn't excavate there because the field was being used at the time. But we found these road cuts. And I feel what we were able to document there was considerable conformity and congruity over a very long period of time. Also going back to the age of the Andarayan site, probably 3,000 years ago, 3,200 years ago, not 4,000 years ago, and yet showing a lot of consistency through time, continuity through time, with the use of riverine environments. I think the Andarayan site was probably located along an oxbow of the river. It's the channel, the active channel at that time, I believe, was further to the east in one of its meanders across the plain, but it never came back far enough to erode away the Andarayan site from within that particular terrace. So we're very thankful for that. It actually showed a site with the oldest remains of rice, not paddy rice, but wild or swidden rice, floodplain retreat rice that were embedded in pottery, red slip pottery, and the radiocarbon dates from the rice and a solid feature, a hearth, were both in the range of about 3,400 or 3,200 to 3,400 back to 3,800 to 3,900. That was seized upon by the out of Taiwan folks to say, 4,000 years ago, 3,900 is almost 4,000. But if you're looking at calibrations and radiocarbon ages, it's just as likely to have been the youngest in that sequence as the oldest. So one can't say with great confidence that it was coeval with any of the other sites further down the river. But it was certainly in the same time range. But it was also part of a continuous settlement of the Cagayan River that we captured in those paleosols a little bit further upslope in a higher terrace. Now, I want to talk about, just briefly, I want to talk a little about chronology building. In the Philippines, we've got a big problem with chronology building because we have so few sites. I mean, we have so little data, it's really hard. And there weren't really very good radiocarbon dating on many, up until the 1970s, we were still having problems with dates like those from the Gakashuan lab. Also, people's knowledge of how to collect radiocarbon dates or samples and how to do like systematic dating for sites was not very well developed. So we get a lot of single age ranges or ages from radiocarbon of charcoal picked out of like an alluvial terrace with probably very disturbed deposits. We prefer, of course, to have something like a charcoal from a seasonal plant. Even like coconut is awesome because they don't move up and down very much. But ideally from features like hearths or something solid. And we don't have that in most sites. And so we have a very, unfortunately, very poor radiocarbon chronology for the Philippines. But also where we have that, we also have a poorly developed chronology. And I think partly that goes back to the same thing that plagues the Bellwood model of Austronesian migration. It is modeled so closely after a European model. It is modeled so closely after Renfrew's Indo-European migration into Europe even with all its problems, as were later revealed. Uh, the chronologies started with Otley Beyer looking at the European uh, chronologies, basically Paleolithic to Neolithic to Bronze Age, Iron Age, and what he eventually called the Porcelain Age in the Philippines, loosely modeled on sequential evolution, sociocultural evolution within a particular place. Um, Many people follow that. Solheim kind of followed the same model to some extent. Uh, Basically in the early 50s and 60s, when he was organizing his data on his survey of the Sawin colonized sites throughout southern Philippines, he developed a model with probably too much specificity, but he at least based it on some real radiocarbon ages. And one of the areas that he defined mostly in all of his findings was the Iron Age of the Philippines, or the Sawin colonized age, going back from about 1,500 years ago to 2,500 years ago, or maybe generously, maybe from 1,000 years ago to 2,500 years ago. And the pottery that he described, which is in the next slide, were from that period and seem to be similar to a lot of other things we're finding. But also, no one ever looked at the possibility that there may be many overlapping and coeval so-called periods or phases of settlement in the Philippines. And I would submit that what we're looking at in many parts of the Philippines is a very long-lasting, quote unquote, Neolithic period or early settlement period with a wide array of tools, pottery, red slip pottery even, showing shellfish use from both the lagoons and the marshes, stone tool use. We've done some Archie Tiaozan and I did some survey for sites in the Alegria region, and Archie documented a lot of what we would call Neolithic sites because of the fact that they had lithics and very relatively crude earthenware pottery from the same sites. And we have dates like that ranging up to 1,000 years ago, and especially 1,500 to 2,000 years ago at sites in Karkar. It looks like there's this long-lasting Neolithic tradition. Matthew Spriggs comments on that too. And it may have been then punctuated by other peoples who maybe have introduced a more sophisticated or different kind of pottery, the Sawin colonized pottery, maybe by 2,500 years ago or perhaps earlier, and maybe some red slip potteries earlier than that, but not as a replacement population swarming the Philippines, but rather more as exploratory movements by peoples already situated elsewhere, especially if they were horticultural, but also people probably primarily exploiting those coastal zones and swidden farming, like floodplain retreat farming on the Cagayan River Valley or up in the highlands. So we're finding sites now in our northern Cebu survey that are giving us a lot of pause. Lovely site from a little rock shelter down near the shore. This overlaps a lot of Bill's Sawin colonized designs. So we're not ready to jump on the fact that this is an Austronesian design with punctated and incised decorations. We are finding obsidian. That's an interesting side note to this in Cebu. But finally, in that northern Cebu survey, we're finding some really compelling things that point to cultural affiliations, we believe from roughly the same period. These are your host, Boboy Acabato's hands around a disc found on a burial dating to about 600 AD, Common Era, in San Remigio during that UOG National Museum, University of San Carlos Field School. This is one found last summer in the same site. It's about the same size without the Linglingo indentation. And this is one that Jobers Bersales found in a catalog of artifacts in Manila that were found at a site in the Gigantes Islands, which are visible from Bantayan Island, just across from San Remigio in northern Cebu. So probably we're guessing about the periods of this. These are the same period, roughly. We're pretty sure from the burials and the types of pottery. This we're guessing may have been the same period. We're going to go to Gigantes and follow that up. But this really looks like a cultural affiliation. And if we were arguing for an Austronesian migration, we'd be about 2,500 years later than that as argued in the literature. But it looks like it may have something to do with cultural expressions defining similarity or affiliations among groups. I'm willing to bet that if we continue our survey, our intensive surveys, we're going to find eventually a lot more, but I'm also willing to bet they're going to be largely from this kind of extensive and long-term, quote unquote, Neolithic settlement with various cultural episodes coming from other places. Are they moving through the region? Hard to tell. If the sites are hundreds of kilometers apart, hard to tell. Anyway, I leave you with that. I hope it hasn't been too complex and too much information, but it's a complex historiography, as I said. But like Alfred North Whitehead said, when we are looking to build scientific models, we're looking for simplicity, but the data themselves aren't necessarily simple. So we're trying to build something simple without disguising or obscuring the complexity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. This is so we recorded this so that we can just capture the narrative and transform it into an article that John has been asking us to write. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or raise your hand, and we'll allow you to speak, or use the chat button. And I think John, Dr. John Terrell has some comments.
Well, I would like to comment. I mean, first of all, I have to admit that I'm trying to get Stephen and John, not just to write an article, but now a book. I'm editing a book series of very short books, and I really want to talk to both of them, and I want to twist their arms to do this. Because early in the talk, John used the expression profound migration. And he and I didn't know, but he and I both love the philosopher Whitehead. And the whole idea of misplaced concreteness is to take our assumptions and our ideas about something and assume they're actually out there, they're real. And one of the problems I've always had with the idea of a migration and an Austronesian migration is the assumption that language can give you this sort of big sense of something is out there. And that's very much the Austronesian argument is that, gee, if you look at all those languages, they look related, okay? But it's a very top-down argument. It's after the fact. We really don't know that history. We really don't know, in a sense, why and how those languages are so related, if they are. And reality, of course, when you look at them, what is an Austronesian language is an extremely good question. But one of the several of the reasons why I don't like the idea of a migration is it as told both in Europe, but also very clearly in island Southeast Asia, it is a racial model. It assumes that people come in kinds and that the kinds move around. It also assumes that race and language and culture all co-vary. They're all saying the same thing. And over and over again in my own research, no, they often are not saying the same thing. You cannot assume that language, for example, is in fact a map of history. Working in New Guinea, I realized fairly soon on that the history of language is, by God, the history of language. And I don't know what it's the history of in terms of what people are doing, where people are going. So I think what really needs to be done, and I would really like to talk to John and Stephen maybe in a Zoom, I think we need to step back and we need to ask, what on earth are we talking about? What is a migration? We're seeing migrations now in Europe. They're very short, they're very motivated. They happen within the course of a moment or two, a year or two, and they are profoundly motivated. So I think we really need to ask, what on earth are we talking about? And what is the evidence needed to sort of see whether this maps what we're looking at in terms of all the wonderful data that John has reviewed? And so I guess I'm hoping that I can convince both Stephen and John to step back. I think that the problem of the Austronesian is a great case study showing that if you don't say what on earth you're talking about, you assume something fits when it doesn't. So I hadn't really thought about it until I started emailing them today. But I think the Austronesian problem is a wonderful example because point by point by point, it doesn't fit what any sort of attempt to understand what a migration would look like. I'm hoping that they will say yes, and that they will work and write a book. And that's all I've got to say. Good talk.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I guess give us 2 years. Yeah, we'll discuss. And
No, it's not 3 years. It shouldn't be. Look, we're talking about maybe 50,000 words at most. No, you can do it. You've already done it. It's and working. We'll do it.
Yeah, thank you, John. One of the when John Peterson, Dr. Peterson mentioned this movement of animals and also people coming from the south. One of the main bases of the Austronesian migration is this push factor of rice agriculture, but recent modeling of rice DNA suggests that rice came from south, from actually Laos through Indonesia and up to the Philippines and Taiwan. But of course, Taiwan has other land races that potentially came from the mainland and also related to land races in Japan. And then I included a link to that publication on the chat. Okay, any other questions or comments? Brother Daya?
Well, Stephen, I will add, if rice is the fuel that drove the migration, then the car of the migration ran out of fuel before it got to New Guinea, and for some peculiar reason kept on going. And so I'm sorry, rice may be big, but I think you've suggested we need to step back from that assumption. Maybe in island Southeast Asia, by the time you get to New Guinea, Peter Bellwood's argument totally collapses simply on terms of what would be the motivation. Anyway.
And there's no evidence of wet rice in the Philippines, at least, that predates 1300s. And this DNA analysis actually suggests that rice was probably, at least their samples diverge from the Indonesian varieties at about 1500 years ago. So a long time since the 4,000-year supposed Austronesian migration. And then, yes, the focus on rice has also stagnated our other potential cultivars like taro, which would have been the basis for or the main staple in the region, and not rice.
I have no questions so far, but I would like to thanks to John Peterson for sharing such an important information and giving such a wonderful talk. That those I am not an archaeologist, but your talk really enriched my understanding of the multiple ways of movement of peoples. So that helped me a lot, and thank you so much.
There's someone's raising hand. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Yenchen.
Nice to meet you. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm Yanjin and student studying in this region. Thank you for the talk. It's very intensive. I would like to ask you a question about your part when you are talking about the sailing technology. Can you elaborate it? I am a little bit confused. Like, so you talk about like the crucial current, and so your point is that you don't think people can sail from Taiwan to Philippines because of the crucial current, or I'm a bit confused about that part.
Well, yeah, and also it's not clear that there were boats, that there were any kind of sailing boats. There's nothing been found archaeologically. That would be unique and wonderful to find an actual boat. But I think
possible in such environment, like in Taiwan, it's very difficult to have that kind of things preserved.
Yeah, exactly. So failing that, but also the fact the terms for it don't appear in the original Austronesian language, Proto-Austronesian, that Blust and others document. So the fact that there are no terms for it suggests something about the lack of sea mobility. I believe, though, Daya, correct me, but I think there are some canoes that were found, or at least traditionally, ethnographically, canoes were used by coastal fishermen to paddle out into the sea. Is that correct? I have a vague memory of that from being, I think, at the Taochung, one of the museums. But anyway, I would argue that it's so far, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, of course, but so far there's no clear evidence of any kind of boats like that coming from Taiwan. But I think that there is more likelihood for that to have been the mode of transportation around the South China Sea in mainland Southeast Asia and in Western Philippines. By the time, what I'm most familiar with is the Micronesian islands, where boats like that are being used today and have a very, very long history. Again, no ancient boats have been discovered. But in order to move among those islands, it presupposes something with that amount of flexibility and efficiency of movement. From Puluwat to Guam, for example, is I think 500 or 600 miles, and there's no way you could paddle it. The proas that are being used today are clearly a good model for that. I think there are images at Borobudur of boats with sails, probably not from as old as the Austronesian period, maybe 1,500 years ago, not sure. Probably some other, and there have been some books. I'd have to look up some of the literature, I think, for you on boats in Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia, but certainly not from the Taiwan area. And so if you consider that a canoe is the best possibility, there's very little way you could paddle that against a stiff ocean current, unless, as Atoll Anderson suggested, you go far out to the west. And by then you're in a whole different context. You're not going to hit Nagsabaran and the Cagayan River. You're going to, if you hit the Philippines, you're going to hit the western side around Ilocos. You'll join the new president there in his homeland.
Yeah, I think for like Xiaochen and her colleagues, they are making statements that the nephrite came from like the Luzon arc to southward to the Cagayan River Valley region. And if there's no like canoe or any like sailing technology, then how can a nephrite get their way to the south?
Well, it was all over mainland Southeast Asia. I had a map. I didn't include everything, but I had a map that showed the extent of findings of nephrite from that source in eastern Taiwan, and it goes way over into mainland Southeast Asia. And again, it's the kind of thing that when this was brought up to Bill Solheim, he'd say, "Well, of course it's there. It's everywhere." It's a highly valued item exchanged throughout the region. And the fact that it could make it in from the south or the west as easily from the north, or more easily than from the north, speaks to the incredible extensiveness of that network, I think.
But Xiaochen also, I read her other articles. She said that she believed that there are at least two currents of nephrite exchange networks. That the first current is like only exchange between Taiwan and the Philippines, and then the second current is around the entire like South China Sea. So
Yeah.
we are talking about mainland Southeast Asia. It's like a later one. It's not the first one.
Right. Okay. Well, that's possible. She's very knowledgeable and she's a very good archaeologist, and she has a lot of other ideas about the pottery and so forth too that we could discuss at great length. But I think one of the big problems I have with something like showing the nephrite comes directly from Taiwan is we don't have any sure knowledge of that. Point A to point B could go all the way around through C, D, E, F, G. It could have been going all the way around through the western part of Taiwan and the northern part of the South China Sea. Excuse me, the Philippine Sea.
West
But
Philippines.
West Philippine Sea. But I do value her opinion, and I would, I'd look at that again. But when I first looked at the ideas of the nephrite exchange, I think that was before she published that. But my concern was looking at this broader map of exchange, finding it really through a very extensive region.
Yeah, going back to that sailing technology, I think John isn't talking about the absence of sailing or the technology. It's just that no one has really talked about it. How we talk about quote unquote migration, but how did they migrate if there's an absence of even a term for proa?
Yeah, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, people could walk from mainland China to Taiwan, right? From sea level rising after the last full glacial period. They didn't need boats during that period. It would have been later, and no one's really sure when those first began to connect up those small islands in the western part of the Taiwan Straits and then with Taiwan. But before that, it was quite a shallow sea. Earlier Pleistocene mammals went back and forth, and people were going back and forth.
Yeah, but in Taiwan, our discovery to date indicated that the earliest pottery can only be traced to around like 5,000 years ago. So it's like way later than the bridge was like.
Yeah, that's right.
So
and it's cord marked pottery. See, here's where I differ with the identification of a similarity between the Fushan pottery in southern Taiwan and the pottery in the Nagsabaran. I saw that pottery in Fushan, and it's a corded grayware like Casey Chang described. I don't know how that became red slipped, and I also don't know how the decorations appeared, although I noted in one of their publications the comment that, well, there were no indentations or incised decorations on the Nagsabarans, on the Taiwan stuff, but it was probably an independent innovation in northern Luzon. And that seems to me kind of a hedge. I don't know what would promote that, but the main thing is there's no really definitive compositional comparisons of those types of pottery. I don't know. There's a lot to be followed up on, I think, in a lot of these comparisons. I think the comparisons are partly accumulating and adumbrating data to prove the Austronesian model. I hate to say it, but it's a matter of trying to prove the hypothesis, or trying to prove the model rather than the other way around.
John, could I add that you're absolutely right. And the problem with the linguistic model, because that's what we're talking about, is that the linguistics that has been done is based on the age area hypothesis. That somehow, because there's a greater linguistic diversity in Taiwan, that must be the homeland, without any attempt to explain why there would be that linguistic diversity on Taiwan, except that for this mysterious idea, oh, it's very old. So the reality is that even as a linguistic model, it is an early 19th century model imposed on that part of the world.
Yeah, what I look forward to more than anything is more intensive data, more intensive surveys, more and more data with the good context and good documentation. And then we can really address all these issues, the nephrite issue too, maybe more compositional or elemental analyses of the nephrite, although I know Xiaochun did some. it's clear that's from that source. The question is, how did it move from one place to another? Clearly by people moving it. Didn't move itself. You're right about that, Yinchen.
Thank you. Let's there's another question, two questions, but let me read Danim Mahirana's question. Can we consider the technology of boat making as tool for migration before the discourse on the rice production?
Yeah, I think we talked about the boats. The rice production, there's a lot of new data, some of it sponsored by Xiao Chun and Mike on rice. Scholar Deng has documented some rice at Noxabaron, but later, like what, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, not 4,000 years ago, which doesn't disqualify its significance in the region at all. But Daya, I could ask you this, is rice, how long historically or has rice been a crop in eastern and southern Taiwan? I know it's found in the industrial park site in the southwest, but was rice a part of that Aboriginal culture in eastern Taiwan?
I'm not sure about it, but for you mean the indigenous people nowadays?
Well, nowadays it's mostly millet, right? I understand. Maybe some later rice paddies.
As I know that for Amis people, for example, they encountered the rice, the culture of rice growing during the Qin dynasty, which is about, I think, 300 years ago, maybe. Yeah.
Very recent.
Yeah.
But Bellwood's model implies, well, asserts that it's a horticultural peoples, probably villagers, who farmed rice as part of their agricultural practice, moved, and with them presumably would have carried the rice. But there doesn't seem to be an area of eastern and southern Taiwan where that would have occurred, although maybe the southwest, not sure.
There are some archaeological sites that shows the existence of the humans before the indigenous people nowadays, and that can be traced back to probably I think maybe Zhihua know more than me, but I think it's about 10,000 years, maybe.
Good. Chiwa's hand is down. Let's call on Chiwa. She said it's 4,800 years ago.
Okay.
In Kiwolan. Or that's so go ahead, Chiwa, please.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the discussion, there are a lot of questions related to Taiwanese prehistory. So I think I'll add some information. Yeah, the earliest rice remains that found in Taiwan is in southwestern part of Taiwan, as John mentioned, in the industrial park. And it's dated to 4,800 BP, around 4,800 BP. It's the core marked culture periods. But at that time, not only rice was cultivated, or we assume it's been cultivated based on the morphology. It's also, we also see foxtail millet and then different kinds of beans. So it's more of mixed subsistence activities. So, and they're still hunting, of course. And then in terms of the boat that the voyage, the tools that for voyaging that we discussed, the earliest archaeological evidence found in Taiwan, it's a little bit late. It's around like few hundred years ago in northeastern part of Taiwan, and it's the direct evidence of the wooden boat, and it's just a wooden plank, and then we see the paddles, and it's being discovered in archaeological site that is well preserved in the underwater. It's not underwater; it's in the locked area. And the other indirect evidence is found a kind of boat shape images on the pottery, and it's in northern part of Taiwan. And it's dated to 3,800 BP. And the material that excavated from the site, it's called the Zhishanyan site in the Taipei Basin. And the material that we excavated from the site is very different from the other archaeological site, other contemporaneous sites in Taiwan. So it's very possible that is from outside of Taiwan. And we have rice discovered from that site too. So it's actually, I'm not saying that we have direct evidence to say that we have people moving from Taiwan to the Philippines, but probably more indirect, as John mentioned earlier, that people interacted along the coast, and then maybe through certain route that they go to Southeast Asia, but not only Philippines, or maybe it's just the interactions between people. They are exchange things in between. So at least to what we understand so far, or based on the evidence we have in Taiwan, as in Philippines, it's very complicated during the Neolithic time periods. Even in Taiwan, we see different cultures or different archaeological artifact, different assemblages, material assemblages in Taiwan. And it's from, in terms of Neolithic, it's from like 50,000 to almost 20,000 BP. And that's a very complicated development all over Taiwan. And that's actually quite similar to what we see in current indigenous population, indigenous cultures in Taiwan. It's very different. And then the languages, the social organizations, the customs, the material culture, they are very different in the indigenous cultures in Taiwan. So I think archaeologically speaking, we see things all over Taiwan. It's similar, and maybe some of them we see in terms of nephrite. We have a very, not very complete, but we systematically sourced the nephrite material, and then it's all sourced to one specific quarry in southeastern part of Taiwan. But the presence of the object doesn't mean that people go there. We cannot say that. Even based on the evidence we have now, we don't have the confidence to say that because of the materials here, so we think people are moving here. There's more, it's more complicated, and I think we need a good model to actually explain, to explore the nuances of these. What happened to this material? Why do they travel all the way to different places? But it's not like a whole package travel to the same places at the same time. It's actually very, very diverse and very complicated. And that's what we can say about Neolithic time or prehistoric times in Taiwan.
That's great. Thank you, Chiwa. Really great. Do you have a citation on that boat image on the pottery? I'd love to see.
Oh yeah,
that.
sure. It's actually being excavated in the early 1990s. So it's been a while. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't
and then we also found fibers at that site.
Oh, wow.
Which is very rare, and it's 3,800 BP, and it's around the time when the famous Yuan culture was in northern part of Taiwan.
Nice.
So they're coexisted with the Yuan people.
Thanks, Chiwa.
No problem, and thanks for your talk. It's really great to see that people actually talk detail about the stratigraphy of the sites in northern Philippines, which we don't, or at least I didn't see that very much. Thanks very much. And then that's the complicated landform change in this area. It's very important. And I agree with you. The landscape between Taiwan and northern Philippines looks very different.
Yeah. I would stay in Taiwan. Mouth of the Cagayan River. I live in Cebu. It's quite pleasant here, but it's incredibly hot and dry there. We've been in sandstorms there where it just grinds the skin right off your face.
So it's really different from the eastern part of Taiwan, the sea coast. It's very nice in the eastern part of Taiwan, and then the sea breeze is really nice during the summertime, even though it's really hot and humid during summertime too, but still the sea breeze is quite different. Yeah, but of course it's now, we don't really know about 4,000 years ago what happened, what kind of weather condition at that time. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have, thank you, Chiwa. We have one more. We have time for one more question, if there's any.
The other thing, I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, do they do any petrographic analysis of the pottery from the Cagayan Valley?
Not really. You know, that's something very disappointing. You know, Dick Schutler and Brian Snow did a fabulous job in that Fugamoro project, but that's in the 1970s. Really good thin section for mineralogy and mineralogical composition. And I don't think they did a little melon analysis, but that was kind of before that. But most of the current studies of pottery don't even really reference that. And I think we do need a lot more baseline comparisons. There's also a problem with descriptions of the pottery. They're kind of vague, and people talk about red slip, but I'm not sure most people know what red slip is.
I don't know that either. I'm not sure that either.
You know, I worked in the Southwest, and we had a pottery called Alma Plain, which almost was defined as the type pottery for red slipping, right? And a slip is something, it's a clay wash that you apply. It could be the same clay material as the potter. It could be different. It's not.
Yeah.
But anyway, when it's put on, it sort of soaks into the vessel, and it creates a lustrous surface when it dries, and especially when it's fired, but it's actually soaked into the vessel. So the slip can be, when you break up on a piece of Alma Plain, it's like, you actually see that there's an embedded zone. Okay, there's a lot of pottery that doesn't have that at all. Maybe a sort of reddish, that may be from the firing temperature. And the other error is there's a lot of red painted pottery. The demolite pottery, red painted, and that's where the paint, it adheres to the surface of the pot, but it doesn't soak in. And so when you cured, you see that it's a separate sort of unconformable layer. And I've seen both those other things described as red slip pottery that really aren't. So I think we have to be really careful looking at how widely dispersed red slip pottery really is in the Philippines.
Yeah. We will have to have a more clear definition about what the red slip pottery is, and in terms of the micro scale observation and then thin section analysis. Yeah, because I did some thin section analysis of the pottery that excavated from northern part of Taiwan, dated to 2000 BP, and we can see from the surface of the pottery, based on the petrography, we see a thin layers of probably what people call red slip, but it's not all the pottery has the same features.
Well, somehow that Fushan pottery is being called red slip. I saw it in the field, and I recall it was gray corded ware, but maybe there was some that was red slipped. I don't know, looking back.
I don't know either. Yeah, I don't know.
There was a problem there too with stratigraphy. I know Peter Bellwood visited the site where those sherds were found in the plow zone, but the plow zone overlies a clay. It could have been the BT horizon. The charcoal that was dated was taken from. So again, the date was somewhere around 4,000, something like that, but it doesn't correspond to the same level that the sherds were in. So that's kind of a consistent problem with stratigraphic. There's a really quick assumption of comparability of stratigraphy.
Yeah, I think we need to do better work in terms of excavation to really focus on the stratigraphy and how we date this material and what the materials are from. The context, as you mentioned, that whether it's from concrete features or it's actually from the layers that is probably washed away from somewhere else, or because of the natural, because the sites I've been working on, we've analyzed some of the chart seeds, and they can be slipped into the bottom layers quite easily because the nature of the soils in Taiwan. So there are a lot of things that we have to be careful in terms of dating the sites.
So we need to do more work. Let's get together and do more work. More
yeah.
work.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
So with that said, let's get back to work. And then I'd like to thank everyone for attending this talk, and of course, Dr. John Peterson for he's busy, and I told him this is going to be for a class discussion, and suddenly, oh, it's public. So thank you, John. For our students, we're going to meet next week on a regular Zoom link. I will talk about Southeast Asian Neolithic and and linking it with this migration models. And then on the following week, Ronald will talk about deer skin trading in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and Japan. Oh, but for now, focus on Taiwan and Japan. So, okay. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good day. It's dinner time here in LA, and so I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.